A diagnosis of bladder cancer can seem like the end of the world. Even though it is the fifth most common cancer, it is not well known by the general public. To many, it seems to come out of the blue. Beacon's Survivor to Survivor program was launched to provide newly diagnosed cancer patients with information and hope. Survivors of bladder cancer know that there is reason to hope. Though it may not seem possible to some who are newly diagnosed, life after bladder cancer can be rich and fulfilling. Through the Survivor to Survivor program, volunteers who are also survivors help show new bladder cancer patients the path forward. Today, we'll cover the basics of the Survivor to Survivor program. First, we'll give an overview of the program. Then we'll delve deeper into the conversation, which is the heart of the Survivor to Survivor program. With some final tips, do's and don'ts to help guide you. And then we'll talk about next steps. In this section, we'll give you an overview of the Survivor to Survivor program, talk about volunteer qualifications, the information we need to collect from you, and Beacon's responsibilities. This volunteer-dependent program fulfills an important part of Beacon's mission. Since we were founded in 2005, Beacon has been dedicated to advancing bladder cancer research, providing information and support for bladder cancer patients, caregivers, and survivors, and raising awareness about bladder cancer. The Survivor to Survivor program fits squarely in the information and support part of our mission. As Survivor to Survivor volunteers, you'll be providing both information and support to newly diagnosed cancer patients. Here's a quick overview of the Survivor to Survivor program. This program is completely virtual. You'll be talking with patients over the phone, and sometimes you'll be emailing them. But as long as you have a phone and an internet connection, you can volunteer for this program. Beacon is responsible for making a match between a patient and a Survivor to Survivor volunteer. We'll go into the information we collect from you to make a match a little bit later in this presentation. The time commitment for volunteers is very flexible. We'll contact you when we have a match, but you can always say no if it doesn't fit with your current schedule. Also, you'll be able to set up a time to talk with a patient that works for you. How often you'll be contacted depends in part on the type of cancer you have, but don't expect more than 2 or 3 a quarter, maybe more after we begin promoting the program. After the call, you'll also be responsible for recommending resources that we should send to volunteers. We want them to know that Beacon has plenty of support to offer. So, qualifications for being a Survivor to Survivor volunteer. First, of course, you need to have survived bladder cancer. Second, we need people who are good listeners. Good listening is important. It's also a necessary part of being a good conversationalist. So you'll be leading a conversation with the patient, but paying very careful attention to their needs. And finally, we need volunteers who are reliable. We'd like conversations to take place within a week, sooner if possible, because often patients will be on the edge of their seats needing to hear from someone. And we need to hear back from you about the resources that you recommend after the call. So you're on the front line dealing with patients, and for that reason, reliability is very important. In order to make a match, we need to know some information from you. We need to know gender, your birth date, so we know your age because that's important for making a match, your age at diagnosis, the type of bladder cancer, and here it's important to say that whether you had muscle invasive or non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, whether you had needed to get a urinary diversion or whether you still have your bladder, whatever kind of cancer you had, there's definitely a place for you in this program. Your treatment experience, we'd like to learn a little bit about this, positive and negative. Lifestyle, and by this we mean mainly family. Are you single? Are you married? Do you have children? If you had children, how old were they when you were diagnosed? These are all facts that can be relevant to a patient and are important when making a match. And finally, occupation. In addition to the demographic information mentioned in the previous slide, you will have a chance on your application to fill in some optional information about yourself. So your ethnicity, your hobbies, and any other facts you think we should know about us. I'm sure that this section will grow over time. The reason that we ask these questions is because we've had patients contact us and they've wanted to be matched with someone with a specific background or specific skill set or set of interests. So that's why we ask for them. Of course, it's up to you. You don't have to fill them out if you don't want to. Next, we want to talk about Beacon's responsibilities. We'll receive referrals and we'll collect information from patients. And you can see the Beacon Connection logo on the screen, and that's where we'll get many referrals, though not all. We also sometimes get calls from patients directly, or we get referrals from other organizations. We will make the match by comparing your information to the patient's information, and then we will introduce you to the patient after, of course, you've agreed to take the call. After your conversation, we'll follow up and learn from you how you think the call went and what resources you think the patient needs, and we'll also follow up with the patient and send them the resources that you suggested. And we'll keep track of patients reached and document the impact of the program. In this section, we wanted to talk a little bit about the conversation that survivor-to-survivor volunteers will be having with patients. There are 3 parts to each interaction between a survivor-to-survivor volunteer and a patient. First, it's the match, which we've already talked about. Beacon will compare the caller's information to survivor-to-survivor volunteers and then approach a volunteer. If you agree to take the call, we'll make an introduction and you'll receive a form that looks a lot like this. It's the patient intake form. We'll fill out the top part so you have a general idea of the patient's situation. Next, you'll schedule a time to speak with the patient, and you will start the conversation by introducing yourself as a Beacon volunteer and telling them a little bit about your experience with bladder cancer and your life now, and then carry on with the conversation, just really tuned in to what their needs are. As you're talking to them, we'd like you to think about the resources Beacon has. You'll be given a list as part of your survivor-to-survivor volunteer handbook. At the end of the call, we'd like you to document the call and also suggest resources that would be a good fit for the particular caller. Here are some things to consider when preparing to speak to a caller to the survivor-to-survivor program. First, you'll want to review the patient intake form, which has information about the caller, and also review Beacon's resources so they're fresh in your mind and you'll have an idea of what you can recommend at the end of the call. We'd like you to think about your introduction as an elevator speech. I know that's a very formal way of starting a conversation, but it's basically just a little bit about yourself, including your experience with cancer and your life today, that will help you get started in a consistent way. We'd also like you to introduce yourself as a volunteer. From there, of course, conversation will go wherever it needs to go. So this is just a starting point. When you describe your experience, we encourage you to use I statements to be clear that you're talking about your own experience. You don't need to feel that you're standing in for all bladder cancer patients. Your own experience is valuable and is what the caller needs to hear. We also want to be sure that even if you're a medical professional, you're not giving medical advice or referring specific doctors. balance your experience with the patient's needs. You have a lot of helpful guidelines and tips to offer because you've been through this. But you may be speaking with a person who only wants specific information. Maybe it's all they can handle right now. They have a few specific questions and then they want to get off the phone. So even though you could talk more, if you're talking with someone who really doesn't want to go into the detail that you may feel is necessary, I would respect their limits and just give them what they're asking for at this point. Recommend resources at the end so they'll always know that we'll be here for them if they need us. The other important thing about this program is you'll be speaking about some very personal information. That's one of the great values of the Survivor to Survivor program. Many callers it may not have even occurred to them what to ask. They may be too embarrassed to talk to their doctor, but you can give them very detailed information about the experience of having bladder cancer. But at the same time, you get to set boundaries. If there are things that you're not comfortable talking about, you don't need to talk about them. Don't feel that you need to reveal everything just because you're a Survivor or Survivor volunteer. If there's something that you're not comfortable talking about, you can say that and just mention to us when you're recommending resources. And finally, beware of monologues. If you find that you're doing most or all of the talking, just pause and check in with your caller or the patient. They may be reticent. They may not know what to ask, so they may be fine. But just if you haven't heard from them in a while, just pause and check in. Here's a brief overview of some of the conversational topics that may come up when you're speaking to a patient. You may and probably will want to go into diagnosis, testing, and treatment decisions. They may be frightened at the thought of the testing. They may not know what to expect, so you can offer them some guidance or some description of your own experience there. Of course, you want to talk about the treatment itself, and what you talk about will depend on the type of bladder cancer you had. Someone who had non-muscle invasive bladder cancer and BCG treatments will talk about something very different from people who have a urinary diversion. So let your treatment guide what you say in this section. If you had a long recovery or a short recovery, or if really recovery was not an issue, this is something that you'll want to talk to the caller about. If you found that you needed help and support of a certain kind, this is really useful for them to know. So think about what you went through during recovery. Think about what you wish you had known beforehand, and let this guide your conversation. Recurrence, hopefully you haven't experienced it, but you can talk about the tests that you get to make sure you're still cancer-free. If you have experienced recurrence, you can talk about that as well. Life after bladder cancer is a huge topic and can encompass everything from social life and hobbies and activities to just the specifics and nitty-gritty details of how life is different after you, say, have had bladder cancer and have had your bladder removed. So what you talk about here will depend on the type of bladder cancer you have and your experiences, but there can be a lot of questions here. And finally, lifestyle and relationships. So this could fit under the life after bladder cancer category. It's an important topic because so many people will be worried about how their relationships will be impacted by their disease. If they're single, they may be worried about dating. If they're married, they may be worried about their relationship with their husband or wife. If they have children, they may be worried about how the children will be impacted. So this could be potentially one of the most important parts of the conversation, but also recall that you can set boundaries, and if things start to get too personal or if the caller has questions that you don't feel comfortable answering, you can set boundaries and then refer to us as needed. In this section, we just want to cover the do's and don'ts of being a Survivor to Survivor volunteer. We'll start with things you don't have to do. You don't have to be a bladder cancer expert. It's perfectly fine to say you don't know the answer to a question, and after the call, when you're following up with us, just let us know what the person wanted more information about. Don't feel that you have to have all of the answers. It's also important not to give medical advice or refer to a specific doctor. Even if you are a medical professional, Beacon is not set up, and this program is not set up to give people that sort of guidance. You don't need to worry about giving people your opinion, your recommendation, or advice. It isn't an advice line per se. It's you talking about your experience, and through that, the patient will learn what is ahead of them, and it will help them make decisions. But we want to just give them information that will allow them to make their own decision. We don't want to try and influence them. You definitely don't need to take abuse, and it is very unlikely that a caller will ever be abusive to you. But if you're ever speaking to someone who starts to shout or treat you disrespectfully, we'd ask you not to fight back, but also not to take it. You can just end the call, let us know what happened, and we'll follow up. And finally, you don't want to share the caller's personal information, which you'll be getting on the patient intake form. Okay, what volunteers do have to do or should do is talk about your personal experience. You have been through something unique, and certainly unique to the caller, and they will get a lot of value from hearing about your personal experience with bladder cancer. Please feel free to provide practical tips. And though we said in the last slide we don't want you to offer medical advice, any other advice you have, such as where to get a urostomy bag or what you ate while you were going through treatment, anything like that, please do share that with a caller. My reason that I put a picture of pills here is because I was thinking, don't sugarcoat the pill. You want to tell your story honestly, including anything negative that happened, because possibly by hearing from you, the caller can avoid that negative experience, and if it can't be avoided, at least they can prepare for it. But overall, we want it to be a hopeful story. You made it through. You are living your life again. So we're asking volunteers to be honest, but also ultimately hopeful. Again, with the boundaries, I mentioned it a couple of times, but it's important that you feel comfortable talking about bladder cancer, and never pushed into talking about anything that is too much for you. We ask that you be familiar with Beacon's resources. You should have received this in your email already, so we just want you to know what we have available so you can make recommendations for the callers or patients that you're speaking to. Now we'd like to talk about the next steps. So next steps for volunteers, please fill out and send in the volunteer form. Review the program guidelines, which are in your handbook, as the forms are. And get familiar with Beacon's resources. As part of your volunteer handbook, you'll have a resource sheet, and you can review that, just read it through, but also click on some of the links or visit our website so you can see what we have available. What Beacon will be doing next is staying in touch with you through quarterly calls. There may be a time gap between when we speak to each other, so we want to be sure that we're all on the same page and we're all in the loop and that you know what's going on with the program. Beacon will begin promoting the program. It's existed for a while informally, but now that we're formalizing it, we're going to start spreading the word. And we'll also work to document the program's impact.